Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So right away, as you can see, I'm not in my usual room/studio setup. It's because I'm in Sevilla right now visiting my friend who just moved here from France. But it doesn't mean we're not gonna make a pickleball video for this week. We're actually gonna be doing a tier list. So I'm gonna have to address some criteria before we get into this. For one, I've said this before with some of our top 5 lists, but we obviously have to carry the paddles. Now, we do carry a lot of paddles now, a lot more than we did at the beginning of the year, but obviously, we don't carry every paddle that's out there right now. I see all your comments, the suggestions of which paddles to carry, and they do definitely help. We try to keep up with as much as we can, but obviously we don't have everything. The second thing is that obviously a lot of paddles have come out this year, some more recently than others. And while I do kind of continuously play with paddles, not just focusing on the ones that I'm reviewing for that week, some paddles I haven't played in a long time. So my opinion of them may not be perfectly adapted to what the industry is proposing now. So for example, if I were to play with a standard carbon paddle now versus when I first played with it in 2021, I would be much less impressed by the playability because of what the rest of the industry has to offer now. I'll try my best to keep it relative to what the industry is right now, but that may play a little bit of a role. The last little thing I want to talk about is that we're only going to be talking about paddles that came into the store in 2023. That doesn't necessarily mean they need to have been released in 2023, but that we brought them in. So there's going to be a lot of thermoform paddles on here, and then some brands that we maybe didn't have last year, but started carrying this year. Without further ado though, let's get to the tier list and start talking about some paddles. Okay everybody, this is Luca from the future. I have recorded the whole tier list video and ended up speaking for a pretty long time. And I don't want this video to be ridiculously long. So today it's going to be part 1 of the video, and then at some point, probably during the rest of this week, maybe early next week, it'll be part 2 of the video. All right, so as you can see, there are a ton of paddles here, and if you know me, you know that I can talk about random stuff for a really long time. I also haven't tried to organize them in any particular way. I tried to keep it as random as possible so that I don't really know what's coming. But yeah, let's get into it. So the first paddle we got here is the Carbon Yonex Power. Okay, this is interesting because it's actually the first unibody thermoform paddle that I used. And because it was the first one, I was so blown away by the amount of power, the amount of spin, and the amount of connection to the ball that I had, that it kind of stayed this mythical best paddle ever in my mind for a really long time. The thing is, it has a slightly muted feel, which takes away from a little bit of its spin compared to some of the other paddles in that category. Here's the thing though, that muted feel does make it a little bit more forgiving in the soft game. Not much, this isn't a paddle that performs very well in the soft game by any means. I think for now, I'm gonna put it A tier, but I do reserve the right to change that potentially. We'll see. Ooh, Proline Energy S. Okay, this is a very good one to follow because compared to the Carbon Yonex, obviously we're talking about Gen 3 thermoformed paddles here, where the industry went super far to the power and spin side. And then as a consequence of that, these brands trying to come up with paddles that were still very good for power and spin, because that's clearly the way the game is evolving, but perform much better than the Gen 2 thermoform paddles in the soft game. And that's where a paddle like the Proline Energy S is absolutely elite, because the Kevlar and carbon top sheet provides a good blend of power and softness. Now my one little issue with the Energy S is that I do find it a little bit muted. It may be that I'm not used to the response that it provides off the paddle bed, but I do think Kevlar feels a little bit more muted than carbon, but the softness that it provides while still having the power and spin and pop of a thermoform paddle is really elite. Like if you were to have sliders on performance in every characteristic, this paddle would be the sliders just moved to the elite characteristics in almost every category, which is why, to me at least, it's an easy S tier paddle for now. Okay, the Prism Flash. That's interesting because a lot of reviewers talk about value. We don't really talk about value because we're a retail store. We want to sell everything we carry. But if we're talking about value, the Prism line is by far the best value in pickleball right now. But here's the thing. I'm not going to take value too much into account on this tier list because I want to base this purely off of on-court performance. That being said, this paddle is fantastic. If we're comparing it to non-thermoformed raw carbon paddles, it performs amongst the best. Now, I do think it's a little bit less stable compared to something like the original Ben John's Hyperion. The thing that's unique about this one is that it has that flash shape, which has completely revolutionized the industry. I think I'm gonna put this paddle B tier for now because, yeah, power isn't as good as Gen 2 thermoform paddles, spin isn't as good either, and I don't think control is quite on the level of the really high-end Gen 1 raw carbon paddles, so B tier for now. Okay, now the Zane Navatil paddle is a fantastic example of what I was talking about when I said a paddle that blew me away at the beginning of the year, that if I were to play with it now, I don't know if it would give me the same sensation, because this thing, it's probably the most spin-friendly non-thermoform paddle. Problem is, it's not thermoform. So as good as its spin is, it's still not amongst the best, when that was probably one of its most redeeming features when I tried it, compared to what else was available in the industry back then. Here's the thing with this paddle. Because it's not thermoformed, it is softer and easier to control than paddles that are better for spin and power. But there is a new type of thermoform paddle that is also extremely spin friendly, more so than the Zane Navatil, and equally as good, if not better, in the soft game. So I'm gonna have a hard time putting this one any higher than B tier for now. That being said, it's still a fantastic paddle, and the shape is a little bit unique too, where the throat slants out a little bit more, so it's more maneuverable than you would expect for an elongated paddle, so very good. Okay, Rhombus R3 Nova. So I obviously just made that little reference about how there are paddles that are as good in the soft game, if not better, than non-thermoformed raw carbon paddles like the Zane Navatil, but still they're thermoformed, so you get nearly top-end thermoform spin, and the R3 Nova is a prime example of that. This is an easy S tier for me. This is probably my favorite paddle right now, if not the R1 Nova. Kind of like what I was saying about the Proline Energy S. It's sliders all the way up in every category, where you have top tier spin, top tier power, good pop, but it is a little bit softer than something like a Carbon 1X power, so you get significantly better performance in dinking, drops, and resets. The edge guard on the Nova is what's really, really unique about this thing, because when you're hitting big, it feels almost as sturdy as something like a Gen 2 thermoform paddle, but then it feels more flexible when you slow down your shots. So it's almost as soft as something like a Zane Navatil or a Prism Flash in the soft game, but then almost as sturdy as a Gen 2 thermoform paddle in the hard hitting game. So it's awesome. I think I want to keep this tier list just S, A, B, C, and not actually have them all ranked against each other in the S tier. But I'm going to say, if I were to make this my personal opinion, I prefer the R3 Nova over the Proline Energy S. The R3 Nova isn't as muted. The feel to me is more connected to the ball, and they're both so elite in all the categories that that better feel is what pushes the Nova ahead for me. But some people really like that muted feel. Okay, the Poach Havoc 2.0. So I don't want to tear this paddle to shreds, but it's just not good enough compared to what we have in the rest of the industry in 2023. I tried this paddle back in January, and compared to what we had back then, so the standard carbon paddles and the SLK Halos, it was okay. It was definitely competitive with those. You got good spin, good power. The one little problem I have now with this thing, and I actually did play with it recently, is that the stability is not that good compared to what is on offer now. It just feels like the sweet spot's a little bit too small, the paddle's too unstable. So unfortunately, I'm gonna have to put it D tier. I do hope Poach comes out with something soon, because obviously they're from Victoria, BC, we're from Vancouver, BC, so they're a local company and we really wanna support them. But unfortunately, this paddle is not that great anymore. Okay, the Halo Max. So this is the shorter version of the Halo series of paddles. So the Halo is kind of like the Poach paddles in that it's just an original raw carbon fiber paddle, and it was really appreciated when it came out because it was a Selkirk paddle. Obviously not the ones that are made in the US, but they're more budget offerings, which still perform extremely well, by the way. It was really good for the price when it came out. I do think it performs better in terms of stability and sweet spot size compared to the Poach paddles. I think they have a better core at Selkirk right now than Poach does. So I'm gonna put C tier. Can't really put it any higher than that, just because compared to unibody thermoform paddles, you just don't get the same amount of spin, power, and you get decent soft control, but not the same stability, so it doesn't perform quite as well for me. Okay, the Vatic Pro Alchemy. Now this is interesting because this paddle has not been super popular, despite it being from Vatic Pro, which is by far our best selling brand. Obviously it is more expensive, but I kind of get why it's not popular. Now, when I tested it, I loved it because it's super, super unique for a few reasons. One, it's more maneuverable than you would expect from something elongated, obviously because of the hole. It's kind of the same story with the Vanguard Power Airs. The other thing about this paddle is that it's significantly more flexible than you think it should be if it's unibody thermoform. Kind of like with the Vanguard Power Airs, that hole just adds a lot of flex, which is a sensation that's very similar to what you get with a tennis racket in terms of flex. So you do feel a lot of control over where you can place your ground strokes. Now that sensation isn't as pronounced in the soft game because you're not getting it to flex as much, but it's a very unique sensation on ground strokes. This is one of my favorite paddles to hit ground strokes with because of that. So I think a lot of people who come from a tennis background should at least try this, but it's not as spin friendly as the Vatic Pro Flash or the V7 because I think some of that energy is lost because of the hole, and that kind of takes away from the whole idea of the unibody thermoformness of this paddle. In terms of power, it's good. It isn't the most stable because of that hole. I don't think Vatic Pro knocked this paddle out of the park. I think they could have done a slightly better job, but I really like playing with it. I'm definitely gonna put it B tier. Okay, the Yonex paddles. Now, this is the first tennis brand that we're talking about. The tennis brands have been funny. I'm still a tennis player, so I don't want to tear them to shreds too much, and I love Yonex on the tennis side of things. But I do feel like these brands have come into pickleball thinking they're just better than everyone, and that whatever they release, people are just going to flock to because of the brand name, which has not been the case because these are not selling because they're Yonex paddles. I like the 15mm core because I think it colors nicely between the lines of kind of that sharp, thin paddle feel and the slightly more controlled feel of a thicker paddle. I also do have to say I like the response they provide because they have that unique fiberglass and carbon combination, so you kind of get that more zingy, poppy feel of the fiberglass with the more muted-ish, controlled feel of the carbon fiber. The problem is the shape of the V-Core and the E-Zone, we'll talk about the E-Zone a little bit later, they're just not very pickleball-y. So it's like, if you wanted to give yourself the best chance to sell the unique feel you provide with that fiberglass and carbon, why didn't you just make the shape something that people know and like? I think it was just a little bit too far gone. I also think they're too expensive, but they are good paddles. They're just C-tier paddles. Okay, the Vatic Pro Flash is a very easy S-tier paddle. Obviously, this paddle and another one we'll talk about later kind of revolutionized pickleball for a couple of reasons. They were some of the original thermoform paddles, and I don't know if you all remember, but the first video we made on this channel was best paddles for spin, and all the comments were saying these paddles are not as good for spin as thermoform paddles. We hadn't tried thermoform paddles, brought them in. I was just blown away by the amount of spin you can get. The response is so instantaneous. You lose no energy in the paddle face, so it's almost like the paddle is a perfect conductor of the spin you're putting from your technique into the ball because it loses no energy. The Flash is great at that, less muted than the Carbon 1X, so more spin. And what the Flash also brought was this hybrid shape. It gives you a very impressive blend of both qualities from elongated and standard paddles, where it feels almost as stable and top tier for spin and power as what you'll get from an elongated paddle, but then so much more maneuverable than those. So the variety you have here is just crazy. I've talked about it before, but this is the type of paddle when you're backed into a situation, you can still whip it super quickly through contact, which you can't do as easily with the clunkiness of something like a bread and butter Filth, just because it is a longer lever. And then obviously at the net, in terms of reactions, it blows elongated paddles out of the water. So this paddle is our best seller of the year with good reason. Top tier, S tier paddle for sure. Okay, the bread and butter Filth. Now, I love this company. I think they are a great group of people over there, and they make fantastic stuff. They make great looking stuff, and they have a good marketing team because they're funny. The bread and butter Filth, to me, obviously it's a lot like the Carbon 1X Power. I prefer it to the Carbon 1X Powers because I think the response is a bit more raw and less muted. So in terms of feel, I think it is a little bit better. The thing is, the Carbon 1X Powers do perform a little bit better in the soft game, so it's kind of a give and take in that sense. I'm gonna put it in the A tier along with the Carbon 1X Powers. Again, these are very similar paddles. The shape is identical, core thickness is identical on the 16mm paddles. But yeah, bread and butter Filth, kind of on the same tier as the Carbon 1X. Okay, the Radical Tour X Raw. So I did kind of just say a few bad things about the tennis companies companies there with the V-Core. I'll give it to Head. I think they're the ones making the biggest push to actually be competitive and not just doing their own thing and hoping it sells just because they're Head. The Radical Tour X Raw is their first raw carbon face paddle. It's a tennis company's first raw carbon face paddle. I do think it's good. I don't think it's as good as the Elite stuff here. It's a very blunt feeling paddle where you'd expect it almost to have the power and spin of a Gen 2 thermoform paddle just based off of that feel, but it isn't quite up there with those, especially in the spin department. I do think the spin is a little bit lacking here, but yeah, not my favorite feel. I'm gonna put it in the B tier. The one thing I'll say with this is, and this applies to every tennis brand, tennis brands know how to make a handle. It's made from the foam they use in tennis rackets, and it just feels way more premium in your hand than what a lot of these paddles have to offer. Tennis brands make better handles, period. So, Control Air Invicta. Now, that is a super easy S tier for me. These paddles are truly fantastic. Now, Selkirk is funny because they don't really care what anybody thinks. They're obviously developing things for a while because the industry went huge for power and spin this year. It was like, if you're not raw carbon, thermoformed, I don't even want to look at you. I don't care. But then they released this banger, which neither feels like a raw carbon thermoform paddle, doesn't look like one, it doesn't play anything like one, and yet it's probably top 1 or 2 best paddles of the year because the amount of control you get with this thing is just off the charts compared to most of the other paddles that we're talking about here. It's got a super, super soft feel. So for dinking resets and drops, it's an absolute cheat code, but it's not like it's bad in the power and spin game because you look at something like a Vanguard 2.0, also a dinking reset and drop cheat code, but absolutely awful if you want to hit with power and spin. You just don't have any feel or connection for the ball because the response is so soft and muted. This thing feels not firm, but very responsive when you hit a big shot. It was really only at the beginning of my playtest with this paddle that I was like, okay, the power and spin is a little bit lacking compared to what I've been using, but once I got used to it, I actually really enjoyed the feel that it provided me because it was more flexy and pockety than the super poppy raw carbon paddles. But when the ball sunk into the paddle bed, you still felt like you could hit with tons of spin when it came out because it's so responsive. So if you are coming from like a Gen 2 thermoform paddle or something like that, you're just gonna have to get used to the fact that it's not gonna be as powerful from the baseline. But once you do, I don't think you're gonna find that spin is totally lacking. The one area where you're going to notice that this paddle doesn't perform as good as thermoform unibody paddles is in pop at the net. You know, put away power with minimal effort. It's not inherently poppy, so you will have to generate effort yourself, but I think that's such a small sacrifice to make for the way, 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 way better performance in the soft game. This is a paddle that I think is going to be super popular despite the price, despite everything else, because it still kind of allows me to hit Tennessee shots, but it complements the soft side of pickleball so much more that it almost forces you to get better as a pickleball player. That's why I think it's such a good paddle. Okay, Rhombus R1 Nova. Now, also easily S tier. The R1 was the one that I first tried. So it was the one that first kind of blew me away with how soft it is in the soft game, but then also firm and responsive it is in the power game. Between the R1 and the R3 Nova, it's really just a question of whether you prefer that Hyperion-like shape or the standard elongated shape. I'm flip-flopping between the two. I really can't tell you which one I prefer right now. Here's what I'll say. R1 Nova, slightly better maneuverability. R3 Nova, a little bit more stable and more top-end power and spin because you just get a little bit more leverage with the standard cut part of the head there. It took me playing R1 Nova and R3 back-to-back to really figure out which one I preferred, and I still don't even know which one I preferred. I think maybe the R3. Comparing this R1 Nova, R3 Nova to the Control Air Invicta. I kind of said it in the Control Air review. Both these paddles are closer to center than like power and spin side of pickleball here and then the touch, softness, and control side of pickleball. It's just the R1 Nova, the R3 Nova, the Pickleball Apes paddles are more power and spin side of center, and then the Control Air Invictas are more softness, control side of center. Which one you prefer is kind of up to you. I do think the Control Airs are maybe a better overall paddle just because they are noticeably better in the soft game, and that complements pickleball a little bit better, but I would probably still go for something like an R1 or an R3 Nova over them. I just think this paddle, this paddle, this paddle, and this paddle are what we should be seeing from the rest of the industry going forward because they are, like I said, sliders put up to the max in every category, even better than something like the Flash, in my opinion. Okay, the Prism V7. This is similar to the Prism Flash, just with an elongated shape. I'm gonna put it in the same tier as the Prism Flash. I think it has the same benefits. It's good, but not totally elite compared to what else is out there. You really can't go wrong with this thing. Go for the V7 over the Flash if you want a little bit more stability, power, and spin because it has better leverage. Go for the Flash if you want more maneuverability and better variety in general. E-Zone, similar to the V-Core from Yonex. It has the same problem where I just think it's too different to what the industry wants. It's good, but doesn't perform super well in most categories. This is a more normal feeling paddle because the shape is more standard. I actually prefer the V-Core. I think the shape is kind of cool. It has a smaller sweet spot, but it also feels just a bit more defined and crisp. But to me, they're both C-tier paddles. Radical Tour Raw. Okay, where did I put the Radical Tour X Raw? I put it B-tier. Okay, I can't put this paddle A-tier, but I do think it's better than the Radical Tour X Raw. Should I put the Radical Tour X Raw C-tier? No, I don't think it's C-tier. Why do I think it's better? I don't think it actually performs much better. Like, obviously, this one's going to be a little bit more maneuverable because it's shorter, and it also is going to be more forgiving because the sweet spot is bigger, because the paddle face is bigger. I just think it's a little bit more unique because the shape is very different to what else is out there. The sweet spot is really big farther up the paddle, so you get a little bit more leverage than what is traditional for a short paddle. I think this one's a little bit better in the soft game too compared to the Radical Tour X Raw, just because the sweet spot feels a little bit softer. But again, it kind of has the same problem as the Radical Tour X Raw. It has a little bit of that blunt feel, not the best spin compared to what you can get. So we'll move on. All right, so that's where we're gonna put a stop to it for part 1 of this video. Like I said, part 2 is gonna be coming in the next few days. Just wanted to remind you that all of the paddles we've talked about and the ones we will be talking about, you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. And please, let me know what you think of this tier list. I know there's probably gonna be some hot takes, controversial opinions and whatnot. So leave me a comment, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and thank you for watching.